Prof. I have a question. Why do sometimes zikr and dancing is associated with deviant teaching?
This idea that zikr and dancing is associated with deviant behavior, there's always been a group from the earliest of times that take this view. Because dhikr, from their point of view, should be a serious affair. Now, dancing is associated with music. Music is associated with deviant practices. For example, drinking wine and alcohol and so on. So then they say, so for example, it was common in taverns, in clubs, in the Muslim world in the past. I'm not talking about modern times. In Ottoman Empire, for example, you would have taverns where they would play the gambus, but alcohol would be served. There would be prostitutes. So the gambus and some other string instruments became associated with these immoral practices. Instead of simply banning the immoral practices, they banned the whole atmosphere, including the musical instruments. So if the gambus is associated with immoral practices, and then you're using the gambus to play music for which the song texts are qasida, devotional qasida, then so they say this is wrong. But of course, the argument against that is that we are not doing those immoral things. And that there's nothing wrong. In fact, it is good to have music because music puts you in a different state, a different hal, to experience the intimacy. And you see from the Zafin that there's separation between men and women. Women dance too, but separately. And there's no alcohol. And it's also a form of Siraturahim. People are coming together. It's a social event as well. But even within the Bahawi Tariqah, there are those who say that these things are haram. There is an opinion which says that string instruments are haram and that we should not be doing these things. They are not against music. They agree with the use of percussion instruments and the reading of qasida to the accompaniment of percussion instruments, but not string instruments. If you go to Hadramaut, you'll find this view is there as well. So, but they consider it as a difference of opinion, ikhtilaf, a difference of opinion. So, if you don't agree that, if you believe that playing gambus is haram, then don't go to a majlis, don't go to a samra where it is done. But in Hadramaut, they don't ban it. They just don't do it themselves. They don't agree with the practice.
Hi. I just have a couple of questions. One is, so you basically mentioned that the version of Islam that spread to the New World came essentially from the Hadramaut area and it was under the Shafi school. But obviously, these practices such as Zafin, etc., culturally were also spread alongside Islam. So are you then saying that, the Shafis of that time were actually practicing Sufi?
Yeah.
And essentially the version of Islam that initially came to Southeast Asia was actually Sufism. Because obviously that's changed quite a bit since then.
Yeah.
The second question actually was relating to women, because I noticed there were no women in those events and the men were essentially performing publicly. But for the women, is there a different form of Zafin? Or is it very much similar to what we saw on screen for the men?
Yeah, okay, thank you for the question. Yes, you're right that Islam, the form of Islam that came to the region was Sufism. Islam has spread in the world through two principal ways. One is through war and conquest. Now, when I say war and conquest, I do not mean that Muslims conquered and then forced people to convert. That rarely happened. But when I say through war and conquest, that means empires expanded, captured territories, and in many of those cases, gradually the people who were captured, who became part of a Muslim empire, became Muslims. Not in all cases. For example, the Arabs ruled in Spain, in Andalusia, for about 600, 700 years. But Spain never became a Muslim country. The Muslims remain as a minority. The Arabs were in Sicily, in what today's Italy, for about 500 years, but Sicily never became majority Muslim country. But in areas where the Ottoman Empire, now the same is true of the Ottomans, in some places where they expanded, like in Bosnia, majority of people became Muslims. In Albania, majority became Muslims. But in other places, the Ottomans ruled over Greece for hundreds of years, but Greece did not become a majority Muslim country. So this is what I mean by Islam spreading through war and conquest. But in our part of the world, now in India, the northern part of India, where you have Hanafi Islam, was generally Islamized through conquest of Mongol, Turkic tribes. And they brought the Hanafi school. They captured India through war, and then they ruled. And then there was a process of conversion. Again, generally not by force, but there was a process of conversion of Hindus to Islam as a result of the conquest. But it's important to get my meaning that the conquest it resulted in conversion, but not forced conversion. But in the southern part of India, in Kerala and in Tamil Nadu, especially in the coastal areas, they are Shafi'i Muslims. And they became Islamized through the Sufi tariqas that came from the Hadramaut, as well as the entire Southeast Asia and also the eastern coast of East Africa. So Islam went to those areas through the Sufi tariqas, not through conquest. Yes, so you're right. It was principally Sufism. Then your other question was, what happened? No, you see, you cannot say as opposed to Sunni, because Sufism is part of Sunni Islam. Now, we are alienated from that idea today, because we have been taught that Sufism is something different, something separate, and part of it comes from the anti-Sufi mentality that you have among some Muslims. The Sufis argue, for example, in an old Sufi work from the 10th century, the Kashf al-Mahjub of al-Hujwiri. He says that in the time of the Prophet, there was Sufism without the name. Because from the very beginning, Islam was understood as this balance between the Zahir and the Batin. But later on, we had Sufism without the practice. So people talk about spirituality, but then you don't really have that balance between the Zahir and the Batin. So the Sufis argue that Sufism is not a part of Islam, it's the core of Islam. It is Islam. That if we define Islam as the balance between the Zahir and the Batin, that's what Sufism is. So Sufism is the core of Islam. So today, we have moved away from that core by one-sided emphasis on the rules and regulations, one-sided emphasis on Sharia, one-sided emphasis on jurisprudence, on fiqh. So your other question was about women. Where are the women? I've never seen women dance. Zapin, I mean Zapin, I've never seen them dance. Usually in this, you see the Hadrami community until today remains quite conservative. I mean, that I have to admit. So when they have Samra, when they have these sessions, like I showed you in the Mukha, right? If you had a session like this, unlike Hadramaut, there would be some mingling of men and women, that in the audience you would have men and women, right? You could see some women sitting in the crowd. But men and women don't dance together. And that's the difference between the Arabs and the local Arabs and the Malays. But in in Zapin Melayu, men and women do dance together. They don't touch, but they do dance together. But with the Arab community, they don't. And women do dance, but they would usually dance indoors, not to be seen by the men. The women can see the men dance, but the men cannot see the women dance. Right? And in the old days, the whole session was also a means of women identifying the eligible bachelors in the community by being in the session and being able to observe the boys who are dancing. Yeah. So there is that segregation. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the explanation about the origins of Zapin. Now, you drew a line between the Arabic Zapin as well as the local Malay Zapin. Now, what are your opinions on how the Malays have adopted Zapin, have practically evolved it to make it more convivial to both men and women in the same space, and how it's now being pushed up as a performance for culture and for entertainment?
I'm not really the one to answer that question. I think Professor Anis should say a few words also if he likes to. He's an expert on Zapin Melayu. But Arab Zapin and Malay Zapin are different. I think the Malays have evolved it further. It's a lot more complex. Probably for many people more interesting to watch. I don't personally have no problem with men and women dancing together. I wouldn't force it on the Arab community because they have a different way of thinking, which is fine. The Malays have done a lot with Zapin. The only thing I lament is that it's not something popular among the people. Now, the fact that it's become formalized, you go and study it formally, it's choreographed, there's nothing wrong with that. But it also should be something that's living among the people, right? That in families, you will have people who learn to play musical instruments, and the children learn to dance Zapin in the time they are kids, and they do it instinctively whenever there are occasions, whether it's Maulud or Hari Raya or weddings and so on. We've lost that culture, and I think having that kind of culture is also a means of preventing us from becoming extreme, right? When you grow up with music and you see music as something religious, as something devotional, you're not going to be able to, you won't be influenced by the more extremist views that come to you and say that this is haram and that is haram. But because Muslims in this country have become separated from culture, right? Culture is seen as a separate realm. That is the same thing as saying that religion has become more of a legalistic affair, right? And we're becoming stricter and stricter as we move along. Anis, you want to say a few words?
Thank you, Farid. That is a very good question. I think let me start. Prof. Farid gave us a very beautiful narrative of how the South in the context of the South in our part of the world has emerged. And what I term in my studies, and we put it mostly in my study, we call it, or I call it, performance Sufism. This one is performance Sufism, meaning to say a Sufistic tradition that embodies kinesthetical and musical structure, organized. It's organized structure, you have to learn the mata to do it. Right? Now, when the Malays look at in Johor, there was a revival and very well culmination with Gaga, with Zapin. They've gone through different kind of dimension. The Zapin in Johor, on Perak, in Terengganu, even in Kelantan, before the 70s, were purely male-dominant tradition. There was no women in it. No women in it means no women appears in public, but the women can appear behind the curtain. So as the men perform the Zapin in front of the household or on the laman, on the ground, women perform at the back in the particular sequential choreographic style. Now, that is when 1970s, the idea of women coming in was initiated by schools. And one thing has Zapin as a one of Malaysian or tradition. henceforth it has become. So what you see on stage is purely artistic dimension of the art of Zahir. But the tarika, the zikr, is still very strong. And the zikr happens not in public, it happens behind the public space. So when you perform the zikr, you can actually, does the zikr here, the remembrance actually step 8 counts. I don't want to show it here, but it can be done, and that's why it is important to understand that in the non-Arabic tradition, we're talking as Sabadia or Bangaria, it is very much inside rather than outside. It's not exclusive, it's more silent, and that's the type of silent zikr. The zikr is silent, it's not uttered. So performatively, it is the beating of the heart, the heart that beats, and the heart is with the rhythmic structure. So that's why in Malay Zahir, it is slower than in terms of the rhythm. It's slower than the Arabic version of Zahir. The movements were created mainly because the Malays were not able to enter into the Arabic space. Yes, you remember, it's the idea of the Arabs by their own kampong, and the Malays can't enter unless you become a woman who is married into the family. So the Malays created their own version, and because of the Malay psyche, thinking of dancing is very curvilinear. The Malays doesn't know how to go straight. They will go all the way winding around, and then they make the decision after 10 minutes after that, right? so in just that, you see the motivic structure of movement of Zahir is equally curvilinear. In the 8 beats or the 16 beats, there are movements that's double than the beats. Okay, so I think that answers your question.
I have a question following the other questions. Have you considered maybe some social cultural factors in our region, or maybe in our time, that we have separated the Zahir and the Batin? It's not just in these spaces, not just when we're talking about Zahir. It is in all spaces that we separate the Zahir and the Batin. And also, following Prof. Attas's addition there, that when we do certain religious or spiritual things, we would do it in private spaces, not in a social context. What do you
I think there are many reasons, but I think one of the important reasons why we have separated culture from religion and has to do with the gradual marginalization of Sufism. And the marginalization of Sufism has partly to do, it's partly an expression of the rise of modernity, the rationalization of life, but it has also to do with the greater influence of orientations in Islam that are indifferent or hostile to Sufism. So, for example, in the the early 1900s, already we are seeing the emergence of the so-called Kaum Muda, and the influence of Salafism, of Wahhabism, right, which tends to stress on the esoteric, on the Zahir, and is indeed hostile to the Batin, right? And this influence became more pronounced from the 1970s onwards. I think we study it carefully, we'll see that there are phases. The earlier 20th century was probably the first phase. Or if you go to Indonesia, actually the 19th century, beginning with the Padre movement. But the 1970s, with the rise of OPEC and the oil industry and the rise of petrodollars, the Saudis started to finance the spread of Wahhabism. And a more recent phase is recently with I would say it has to do with the rise of Iran, the Iranian Revolution, the Syrian war, and the further spread of Salafi teachings. All of this explains. And we now have open hostility in one of the states, can't remember where, was it Wilayah or one of the states in Malaysia, the Naqshbandi Tariqah is declared as Sesat. Yeah? So you have even open hostility towards Sufism. So it's one of the explanations. But at the same time, as a response to the coldness and hardness of modernity, the impersonalness of when I say that, what I mean is, see, we're living in a world where the dominant values are reduced to market values, right? The dominant values have to do with predictability, calculability, quantifiability. Everything is based on KPIs, is based on performance, and no longer, spiritual values. As a response or a reaction to that, you have the rise of mysticism across all religions, including Islam. And in Islam, it takes the form of Sufi revival. So we're seeing a revival of Sufism throughout the Muslim world. It's a bit difficult in Malaysia because, unlike many Muslim countries, Malaysia is officially controlled by a religious hierarchy, which tends, I think, to be hostile to or indifferent, either indifferent or hostile to spirituality and to Sufism. So the revival of Sufism, I think, is facing more difficulty in Malaysia as compared with Indonesia or India or even Pakistan, other countries.
I was going to ask why that been more centralized in Johor, but Professor mentioned that this has happened in other states. Because it's happened in other states, except in Johor. But is there an explanation why it's more stronger in Johor compared to other states in Malaysia?
I don't know. I don't know if my answer is correct. Maybe I'm sure Anis knows better. But I would guess that it's because of the concentration of the Arab community in Johor. In Johor Bahru, in Batu Pahat, in Muar especially, you have an old Hadrami Arab community. Until today, you have Arab quarters in those states, in those towns, since the 19th century. And then many of the teachers of those who perform Zapin Melayu were from that community, from the Johor Arab community. And I think that's probably one reason. We find the same thing in Indonesia, that Zapin is prominent in those towns where you have a strong Arab community with Arab quarters. So because of the community, the Zapin culture thrives, and it spills over into the Javanese or the Indonesian, other Indonesians. But Zapin has a better, Anis has a better answer than me.
From the 18th century all the way to the 19th century, Zapin has mostly been in the royal court of Sumatra, of Kalimantan, and none is Malaysia. You know why? Because these courts have connection with the who were either scribed by scribes or intermarriages or instances. And therefore, Zapin existed under the patronage of the royal court across the border. We found Zapin to be active in Johor in the first place in around he was almost dated in 1990s. I embarked on my dissertation studies in the doctorate and got my work published at Oxford University. That was the beginning of the revival, because the Johor state took notice of it. And it was a Johor state initiative, put it again, it is a Johor state initiative to revive Zapin life to what it is today. I helped them all through, but it was a state initiative. And through the state initiative of funding youth in infrastructure, there were very clear, observable, physical line frontage between Zapin Melayu and Zapin Arab. Not negating Zapin Arab, but encouraging Zapin Arab to go along with Zapin Melayu. But in Johor, it became that tradition above the rest because Zapin is more powerful than Kuda Kepang, which is brought by the Japanese, or Kamila or any other thing by Banjaris, because it has what Prof. Farid said, that unifying factor of spiritual cohesiveness through sophisticated tradition. That's how Zapin became Johor on Taj from the 1990s onwards. And today it is gone through whatever process. So the idea of state engineered tradition Zapin is an excellent example. Other states have done the same. but you have to have critical will, and you have to have scholarship and practitioners to do it. I hope I answered this question.
I have a question regarding you said that for Sufis, this to them is like celebration for the afterlife, and it's because the afterlife is better than the current life. To me, it sounds like somehow it's part of the ideology of Salafism and Wahhabism. They also encourage their followers with this. They have this kind of similar ideology. So my question is, what's the difference with this part between the Sufism and Salafism and Wahhabism?
One is the implementation of Islam. Like, what is the distinction between the local cultures? It seems like the people in Hadramaut has made this dance again to signify their way of worship according to what Islam is about. What do you think is the distinction between like local cultures versus the actual practice of Islam? Like, do you have any opinions about it? Because Malays have their own interpretation.
Okay. Yeah.
I feel like Islam is very culturally different from place to place. The practice of it.
All right.
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. You said Salafism and look, all Muslims believe in the afterlife, and they believe the afterlife is a better place. So to say that Salafism and Sufism are similar because they both believe in that, I think it's not correct. All Muslims believe in that, but there is a world of difference between Salafism and Wahhabism on the one hand and Sufism on the other hand. There are so many very important theological differences, belief in the nature of God, the question of interpretation of text, the importance of the balance between Zahir and Batin. These are all things that set aside Sufism from Salafism. There isn't time to discuss this at length, but Salafism is of course a new school. It's a new approach, and it's literalist in terms of interpretation of text. Sufism is the opposite of literalism because it's based on levels of interpretation, from tafsir to ta'wil, and so on and so forth. So there are many important differences. The conception of God, the Sufis, like other Muslims, even non-Sufi Shafi'is and Hanafis and Shiites, for that matter, don't have a literalist understanding of the nature of God. We don't anthropomorphize God. We don't do tajsim. So there are many differences which I think are fundamental. Your question on Islam and culture. You see, there is no such thing as pure Islam without culture. The only Islam that exists without culture is Islam in the mind of God. Once Islam is revealed to human beings and is interpreted and practices, there are cultural differences. You will not find Islam to be the same anywhere in the Muslim world. You look at the architecture of mosques, you look at the tradition of poetry. It differs from, even within the Arab world there are differences. You look at and you compare with the Persian tradition, the Turkic tradition, the Indian tradition in the Malay world, architecture, cuisine, food, literature. It's all different, but all are Islamic, all are expressing Islamic values. So Islam is culture. There are different ways of expression of Islam, which is what we call culture. There isn't a pure Islam without culture. Even the practice of the Prophet and the early Muslims was mediated by Arab culture. For example, the practice of recitation of the Quran, of memorization of the Quran, it could happen among the Arabs because they already had that tradition of memorization of poetry for generations before the coming of Islam. And certain practices which we have adopted through imitation of the Prophet, for example, breaking our fast with dates or eating dates. This is part of the culture of the Arabs. So there are so many aspects of Islam which are defined in terms of the culture of the Arabs, and then they became generalized across the Muslim world. But at the same time, the Muslims improvised, sort of adapted Islamic beliefs and practices to their own culture, in terms of poetry, in terms of architecture, in terms of cuisine. So culture is a part of religious practices. Not only is it a part of religious practice, it is impossible to have Islam without culture, unless everybody is to become an Arab. I mean, to become an Arab of the time of the Prophet, which is impossible.